you. Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning to you. You, good morning, good morning to you. You, good morning, good morning. Good morning, and welcome, welcome. I hope that you all are having a great and wonderful day. Let me see. Let me make sure that I can unhide my video. And those of you who are watching by Black Table Talk, let me know if you can see me. As a matter of fact, let me check it for myself. I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful morning. We are back at looking at Malcolm, Martin, and Medgar's life. So that's where we are right now. And let me make sure that my Black Table Talks peoples can see the video. Okay, perfect. All right. So for some reason, I can't see my own video. I can't seem to see my own video on Black Table Talk. Let's see. I want to make sure that it is not giving a blank screen. Okay. Let me check for sound. Sound. Let me check for sound. Okay, perfect. All right, so as long as they can see me over there, that'll work. All right, so again, we are getting back into reading and study of Medgar, Martin, and Malcolm. We're picking back up first in Medgar and Merle, the book about their life and their love. And we are on the section where Medgar has returned from the war, but she is sort of recounting his experience in the war. So that's where we are picking up. Like his elder brother, Medgar relished his experience in Europe despite the segregated services. The horror was real. Seeing the bodies of dead soldiers littering Omaha Beach changed something within him. He later told Charles. It hardened him. He was moody and started doing uncharacteristic things like swearing. Some of the white officers were deliberately cruel, bringing a touch of Mississippi overseas. But Europe was not Mississippi. There was no Jim Crow system of formal racial segregation and no Ku Klux Klan. People in England and especially France often treated Black Americans with a normalcy that eluded race. Medgar's military service gave him confidence and perspective, and it heightened the contradictions between the mission of fighting for liberty and freedom abroad, while at home as a Negro man, he had none. So we know that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this double consciousness, but for military men, you might as well say it was a triple consciousness, right? And there were the women. French women seemed particularly intrigued by Black American men, or at least they were free to show it openly. Unlike in the American South, going around with them was neither illegal nor particularly frowned upon, as long as no white American soldiers were around. This allowed Medgar to experience something that would have been incredibly dangerous, even life threatening in Decatur, a romance with a white woman. It happened in Cherbourg. The woman was the daughter of a French couple he'd befriended. Unbelievable to him, he could hold her hand and even kiss her in public without fear of reprisal. Her parents even approved of the union. It was a mesmerizing change of status. Back home, he would likely have been lynched for such a romance. In France, white U.S. servicemen frequently tried to prevent black troops from interacting with white women. They spread rumors among French locals that black men were rapists or even that they had tails. The racist propagandizing didn't work. More than 350,000 black men had served in France during World War I, nearly 100,000 of them seeing combat under French commanders. So blacks were not viewed as alien in the country, which continued to operate a colonial empire that included countries like Guadeloupe, Niger, and the Ivory Coast. France was not free of racism, but it did not have institutionalized discrimination and terror based on color alone. And good morning to those of you who are coming in. Outside of American barracks, black soldiers could move around freely. And there was Paris. Since the 1920s, the city had been a magnet for black artists such as Josephine Baker and a hub for the popular spread of jazz, though many of these Americans left the country as the Nazis invaded and began to outlaw the corrupt influence of jazz. After World War II ended, Paris was still reeling from the physical and emotional ravages of war and Nazi occupation, and food rationing was still underway. Despite this, the city became an even greater magnet for African American artists, writers like Chester Himes, William Gardner Smith, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright, as well as musical performers who wished to escape the limitations of segregated venues in the United States. Part of Medgar wanted to stay in France after the war, the way Baldwin and Richard Wright had done. Wright, like Medgar, was a Mississippi native and the grandson of enslaved people born in 1908 on Rucker Plantation near Natchez, Mississippi, where his father was a sharecropper and his mother a school teacher. He called Paris, quote, a place where no one could claim one's soul. Medgar shared Wright's impatience with the limits America placed on blackness. He was proud of being black and chafed at the pressure on black Americans to feel or act ashamed. He was in Cherbourg, less than 2 hours away from Paris, so it could be done. He could simply refuse to go home. He had a girl whose family accepted him. He could have a life outside of Decatur and racist Mississippi. It was a temporary dream. He wrote to Charles that he saw no reason they should have to leave Mississippi in order to succeed. He wanted to put his foot down in his home state and raise black children in freedom there. This is home, he later said. Mississippi is a part of the United States, and whether the whites like it or not, I don't plan to live there as a parasite. The things that I don't like, I will try to change. And in the long run, I hope to make a positive contribution to the overall productivity of the South. Although Medgar shared some of the rage that drove Charles to declare his utter hatred and contempt for white people, his relationship with Paris, sweetheart, and the sweetheart convinced him it was possible for blacks and whites to live together harmoniously. He told Charles that when they got home from Europe, they were going to fix things. Still, neither he nor Charles could bring their white girlfriends home as their wives. They knew better than that because they were returning to Mississippi. So they both came back on home alone. Still, Medgar saved his Paris girls' letters until he married. Their mother begged them to stop writing to these women. Charles' girl was Filipino, for fear that local whites would accuse the Evers boys of quote unquote messing with white women. Now, my God, that was a mouthful. There's a couple of things I want to go back and think about. One of them is the fact that Medgar says, "This is home. Why should I have to go and build somewhere else? Why should I have to go and live somewhere else? Why can I not have the Black American dream? Why can I not, you know, raise my children, marry and start a family and live out my dreams as a Black man in America? Why do I have to have these kinds of restrictions put on my dreams?" And still today, Black people are asking some of the same questions, right? They're asking, why can't I live in peace? Why can't I own my home without having to worry about neighbors calling the cops on me for watering my neighbor's lawn? That actually happened. Um, why can't I live in relative peace without someone trying to harass me, or someone trying to profile me or stalk me or surveil me, or just assume that I don't belong in a certain place, a certain position, or have a certain status? I can tell you more than once in my own life, we've been stopped by the police, and rather than the first question be, "Can I see your license and registration?" the first response when they come to the car is, "Oh, this is a nice car you have." What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? So, are you stopping me because I have a nice car and you don't think that I should be driving a nice car? Or are you stopping me because I violated some kind of traffic law? What is actually happening in this exchange? And I think that that is a very powerful statement. Like he said, this is home. Mississippi is a part of the United States. Because what was happening with Jim Crow? These states were not acting as if they were a part of the United States. They were acting as if they were a country unto themselves. And yes, you have state laws, but that's not what Jim Crow was about. Jim Crow was about subjecting a certain demographic of people to mistreatment, to unequal treatment, to discriminatory treatment. So it wasn't just states' rights, it was states' rights to suppress Black life. And that's what made Jim Crow a very, very insidious thing. The other thing the author here mentions is the fact that, yes, they were living a more free life in Paris, but there were still people who were from America, white men from America, who were still carrying vestiges of the Jim Crow mindset, and they were dispersing it in other places. So even though they were in another country and they were, um, fighting on behalf of America, they still had people that were trying to undermine their freedom. They still had people who were trying to undermine how they were seen in other countries. Now, as she points out, there were enough Black people in the country, enough Black men in the country at that time, that people could clearly see that some of the things were a form of propaganda. But it still did not stop them from trying to export racism, bigotry, propaganda, stereotypes to other countries. And over the years, we have seen what that has looked like. The last thing I want to point out here is the fact that even though they were experiencing other relationships, right? They were experiencing their interracial relationships. They knew ultimately that in order to return to the America that they were living in, that they had to let those relationships go. They could not continue them and think that they were going to, like she said, return home with their girlfriends who would then be their wives and live peacefully in Mississippi. And the irony of all of this is that as much as Medgar tried to go back to Mississippi, right? He married a black woman, had black children, was living in his own home, driving his own car, working for the rights of black Mississippians and Mississippians in general who were experiencing any kind of discrimination. As much as he tried to enact his personal will to live out that dream, he was still cut down in, really, I would say, not even the prime of his life, but in the very beginnings of seeing that dream. And so it wasn't just Martin, right? When Martin said, I have a dream, it wasn't just Martin that had dreams. Lots of people have dreams in America. And whether or not we are willing to do what it takes to make sure that people are able to live out their dreams in peace remains to be seen. Remains to be seen. And good morning to those of you who are coming in. And we're going to pause there in our reading. And the book I just read from is Medgar and Merle. We're picking up a new book today to look at the life of Malcolm X. Again, we are reading excerpts. We started in May and we are now in June. We're going to keep reading through June. And this is by Manning Marable. Manning Marable has done um, several books on Malcolm X. This is just one of them. And he's done some other well known people in history. This one is called A Life of Reinvention, Malcolm X, if you're looking for the specific book. We're going to take a look at his section called Life Beyond the Legend. He's going to talk about what happened with Malcolm, and he's going to talk about what was leading up to Malcolm's death. So that is the section that we're going to be reading from. This is from the prologue. Okay. In the early years of the last century, the neighborhood just north of Harlem, later to be named Washington Heights, was a sparsely settled suburb. Only the vision of a businessman, William Fox, led to the construction of an opulent entertainment center on Broadway between West 165th and 166th Streets. Fox's instruction to the architect, Thomas Lamb, was to design a building more splendid than any theater on Broadway. By the time all was finished in 1912, an expensive terracotta facade adorned the front walls, marble columns stood guard at the entrance, while carvings of exotic birds graced the foyer. It was these colorful motifs inspired by the great 19th century artist John Ames Audubon that prompted Fox to name his pleasure palace the Audubon. On the building's first floor, Lamb designed a massive cinema large enough to seat 2,300 people. In subsequent years, the second floor was reserved for two spacious ballrooms: the Rose Ballroom, which could accommodate 800 patrons, and the larger Grand Ballroom, holding up to 1,500. Within a few decades, the neighborhood around the Audubon began to change, becoming increasingly black and working class. The Audubon's management catered to this new clientele by booking the most celebrated swing bands in the era, including Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Chick Webb. The Audubon also became the home for many of the city's militant trade unionists, and from 1934 to 1937, the newly formed Transport Workers Union held its meetings there, accompanied by the occasional violent confrontation. One night in September of 1929, for example, 400 strong party sponsored by the Lantern Athletic Club was disrupted by four gunshots. Two people were badly wounded. During World War II, the Audubon was rented out for weddings, bar mitzvahs, political meetings, and graduation parties. After 1945, however, the neighborhood changed yet again, and as many white middle class residents sold their properties and fled to the suburbs. Columbia University's decision to expand its hospital at West 168th Street and Broadway into a major health science campus generated hundreds of new jobs for the black influx, while the Audubon adapted the space it had occupied into rentals. However, both the Rose and the Grand Ballrooms remained. By the mid 1960s, the building had surrendered most of its original grandeur. The main entrance for the ballrooms was small and drab. Customers had to climb a steep flight of stairs to the second floor foyer, then maneuver past the manager's office and either into the rows at the building's left side or the grand, which faced Broadway. The larger room was about 180 feet by 60, its northeast and west walls housing a 65 separate booths, each of which could hold up to 12 people. Farthest from the building's main entrance along the south wall was a modest wooden stage, behind which was a cramped, poorly lit antechamber where musicians and speakers could muster before walking out to perform. On the winter afternoon of Sunday, February 21st, 1965, the Grand Ballroom had been reserved by the controversial Organization of Afro American Unity, also known as OAAU, a Harlem based political group. For nearly a year, the Audubon's management had been renting the ballroom to the group, but it remained concerned about its leader, Malcolm X. About 10 years before, he had arrived as the minister of Temple Number 7, the local headquarters for a militant Islamic sect, the Lost Found Nation of Islam. Later commonly described in the press as black Muslims, its members preached that whites were devils and that black Americans were the lost Asiatic tribe of Shabazz, forced into slavery in America's racial wilderness. The road to salvation required converts to reject their slave surnames, replacing them with the letter X, the symbol that represented the unknown. Members were told that after years of personal dedication and spiritual growth, they would be given original surnames in harmony with their true Asiatic identities. As the nation's most public spokesman, Malcolm X gained notoriety for his provocative criticisms of both civil rights leaders and white politicians. The previous March, Malcolm X had announced his independence from the Nation of Islam. He quickly established his own spiritual group, Muslim Mosque Inc., MMI, largely for those Nation of Islam members who had left the nation in sympathy with him. Despite his break, he continued to make highly controversial statements. There will be more violence than ever this year, he predicted to a New York Times reporter in March of 1964. For instance, the whites had better understand this while there is still time. The Negroes at the mass level are ready to act. The New York City Police Commissioner responded to this prediction by labeling Malcolm, quote, another self proclaimed leader who openly advocates bloodshed and armed revolt and sneers at the sincere efforts of reasonable men to resolve the problem of equal rights by proper, peaceful, and legitimate means. End quote. Malcolm was not intimidated by the attack. The greatest compliment anyone can pay me, he responded, is to say I'm irresponsible, because by responsible they mean Negroes who are responsible to white authorities, Negro Uncle Toms. End quote. Several weeks later, Malcolm X appeared to experience a spiritual epiphany. In April, he visited the holy city of Mecca on a spiritual Hajj, and on returning to the United States, declared that he had converted to Orthodox Sunni Islam. Repudiating his links to both the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad, he announced his opposition to all forms of bigotry. He was now eager to cooperate with civil rights groups, he said, and to work with any white who genuinely supported black Americans. But despite those avowals, he continued to make controversial statements. For example, urging blacks to start gun clubs to protect their families against racists and condemning the presidential candidates of the major parties, Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, as providing no real choice for Black people. Most OAAU programs were choreographed as educational forums for the local community, encouraging audience participation. For the February 21st meeting, the featured speaker was Milton Gallimison, a prominent Presbyterian minister who had organized protests against substandard schools in New York City's Black and Latino neighborhoods. The OAAU had not directly participated, but Malcolm had publicly praised the minister's efforts, and his lieutenants may have desired an informal alliance. Although the afternoon's program had been advertised to begin at 2, by the starting time, barely 40 people had passed through the main entrance. The sparse early turnout may have been a reaction to fears of possible violence. For months, the nation had been engaged in a well publicized feud with its former national spokesman, and Malcolm's followers in Harlem and other cities had been physically assaulted. Only a week earlier, his own home, located in the quiet neighborhood of Elmhurst, Queens, had been firebombed in the middle of the night. To guard against a public confrontation, the NYPD had assigned a detachment of up to 2 dozen officers at OAAU rallies whenever held at the Audubon. This is important. One or more policemen, usually including the day's detail commander, would be stationed on the second floor in the business office, where they would have an uninterrupted view of everyone entering the main ballroom. Many of the others were prominently stationed at the main entrance or located outside, directly across the street in a small playground area residents call Pigeon Park. On this particular afternoon, however, not a single officer was at the Audubon entrance, and only one briefly was stationed in the park. Now, this information later comes out, but I knew this information when I was 13 years old. And I'm going to tell you how I knew it. I had an uncle who lived in New York at the time who was a practicing or is a practicing Sunni Muslim. And one of the things he told me, he said, number one, he believed it was an inside job. And number two, he said there were no officers within a square mile radius when everything went down. And so my uncle always believed that the assassination was a inside job and that it was a politically motivated hit. So I find it very interesting now that these things are coming to light and people have gone back and looked at who actually did the assassination, who was actually behind it, were the people who were charged with it actually the ones that carried it out. But that's another conversation for another time. On this particular afternoon, however, not a single officer was at the Audubon entrance, and only one briefly was stationed in the park. No one was seen inside the business office. In fact, just two uniformed patrolmen were placed inside the building, both having been ordered to remain in the smaller and but for them unoccupied Rose Ballroom at a considerable distance from the featured event. And good morning to those of you who are coming in. The absence of a substantial police presence would prove critical because earlier that morning, 5 men who had been planning for months to assassinate Malcolm X met together one final time. Although the venue of that meeting was in Paterson, New Jersey, all 5 were members of the Newark Mosque, of the Nation of Islam. Only one conspirator was an official of the mosque. The others were Nation of Islam laborers and assumed that their actions had been approved by the nation's leadership. After meeting at the home of one of the conspirators, where they went over each man's assignment one final time, the 5 men then got into a Cadillac and headed for George Washington Bridge. They exited in Upper Manhattan and found a parking spot close to the Audubon that would also provide quick access back to the bridge and an easy escape to New Jersey. The sole security force inside the grand ballroom and at the main entrance was about 20 of Malcolm's followers. The head of Malcolm's security team was his personal bodyguard, Reuben X. Francis, who earlier that afternoon had told William 64X George that the day's team would be undermanned and that he would need his help. Usually, the dependable William would stand next to the speaker's podium, placed directly in front of center stage, where he could view the entire audience. On this particular day, however, Reuben instructed him to stand at the front entrance, about as far as he could have been from the stage. Rubin also delegated some decisions to the event security coordinator, John DX, whose job was to supervise guards around the grand ballroom's perimeter. The normal protocol was for security teams to stand for up to 30 minutes, a demanding assignment, especially for those with no prior experience in policing crowds. Usually, the most important positions went to former NOI members, all of whom had both security experience and martial arts training. If a known NOI sympathizer attempted to enter an event, he was to be questioned quietly but firmly. Nation of Islam members who had personal histories of violence or were known for hostility toward Malcolm would be escorted from the building. One such man was Linwood X. Cathcart, a former member of Malcolm's Mosque Number 7, who had recently joined the Jersey City Mosque. He had entered the Audubon at 1:45 and seated himself in the front row of wooden folding chairs that had been placed across the dance floor. Malcolm's team spotted him at once, reckoning that his presence could mean trouble. Cathcart now brazenly wore an NOI pin on his suit lapel. Reuben persuaded him to go with him to the rear of the ballroom, where after exchanging words, he insisted that he remove the offending button if he wished to remain. Cathcart complied and returned to his seat. Malcolm's security people would later insist that he was the sole NOI loyalist they had spotted. Handling the necessary custodial duties that afternoon was Annis Lukeman Langston Hughes Savage, another NOI member who had severed ties with the nation out of loyalty to Malcolm. In his subsequent grand jury testimony, Luckman placed his arrival time at around 1:20. He briefly talked with a few people and, as he had done many times before, arranged the chairs on stage, positioned the speaker's podium, and removed some surplus equipment. He then went out into the audience and just stood around until the meeting started. Sometime after 2, he decided to recheck the doors, located at stage right, closest to the speaker's platform. For whatever reason, they were unlocked, which troubled him. But instead of notifying Malcolm's security people, he returned to his seat. Despite the recent firebombing and the escalating threats of violence, Malcolm had insisted that none of his security team, with the sole exception of Reuben, should carry arms that Sunday. At an OAAU meeting some evenings before, his orders had been vigorously challenged. Malcolm's chief of staff, James 67X Warden, was convinced that the failure to tighten security that afternoon almost certainly would invite trouble. As he later explained his actions, we wanted to check for weapons, but this was an OAAU public meeting. Malcolm said, "These people are not accustomed to having anybody search them. We're dealing with an entirely different group." As a result, as people entered the Audubon, many wearing bulky winter coats, no one was stopped. If Reuben was worried by this, he didn't appear so, and even left the ballroom to pay the manager that afternoon's $150 fee. By this time, all the would-be assassins had entered the building. As they anticipated, no one searched them for weapons. The group then split up. The 3 designated shooters found chairs in the front row, either in the front of or to the left of the speaker's podium. One shooter, a heavy-set, dark-complexioned man in his mid-20s, was to deliver the initial hit. 2 others were carrying handguns. Their final task was to finish off Malcolm after the initial shots. The final 2 conspirators sat next to each other on the wooden chairs, about 7 rows back from the stage. Their assignment was to create diversion. If possible, one of them was going to ignite a smoke bomb. By 2:30 p.m., the audience had grown to over 200 and they were becoming impatient. Benjamin 2X Goodman, Malcolm's assistant minister of Muslim Mosques Inc., came on stage and began a 30-minute warm-up. Because Benjamin was not among the featured speakers, Most people continued talking or wondered about seeing friends. After about 10 minutes, Benjamin's remarks began to attract attention as he recalled recent themes in Malcolm's rally speeches, such as opposition to the Vietnam War. Everyone knew that Malcolm almost always came to the podium immediately following Benjamin's introductions. Several minutes before 3 p.m., he was still exhorting the audience when, without warning, a tall, sandy haired man walked briskly out and sat on a chair a few feet from the podium. Caught off guard by his leader's entrance, Benjamin hastily finished up his remarks, then turned to sit down on one of the folding chairs on stage. As a rule, for safety reasons, Malcolm was not permitted to be there alone. On this occasion, however, he stopped his colleague from sitting, whispering instructions into his ear. Looking puzzled, Benjamin stepped down and returned to the backstage room. Assalamu alaikum, Malcolm proclaimed, extending the traditional Arabic greeting. Walaikum salam, hundreds chanted back. But before he could say anything further, there was an unexpected disturbance about 6 or 7 rows back from center stage. Get your hands out of my pockets, a man shouted to the person next to him. Both men stood up and began to tussle, diverting everyone's attention. From the stage, Malcolm yelled out, Hold it, hold it! The two principal rostrum guards, Charles X. Blackwell and Robert 35X Smith, scrambled to break up the men. Most of their colleagues also moved from their positions to quell the disruption, leaving Malcolm completely alone on stage. It was then that the conspirator in the first row stood up and walked briskly toward the rostrum. Beneath his winter coat, he cradled a sawed off shotgun. About 15 feet from the stage, he stopped, pulled back his coat, and lifted his weapon. For many African Americans, February 21st, 1965 is engraved in their memory as profoundly as the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. In the turbulent aftermath of his death, Malcolm X's disciples embraced the slogan Black Power and elevated him to secular sainthood. By the late 1960s, he had come to embody the very ideal of blackness for an entire generation. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and James Baldwin, he had denounced the psychological and social costs that racism had imposed upon his people. He was also widely admired as a man of uncompromising action, the polar opposite of the nonviolent, middle class oriented Negro leadership that had dominated the civil rights movement before him. The leader most closely linked to Malcolm in life and death was, of course, King. However, despite having spent much of his early life in urban Atlanta, King was rarely identified as a representative of ghetto blacks. In the decades following his assassination, he became associated with images of the largely rural and small town South. Malcolm, conversely, was a product of the modern ghetto. The emotional rage he expressed was a reaction to racism in its urban context. Segregated urban schools, substandard housing, high infant mortality rates, drugs, and crime. Since by the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of African Americans were living in large cities, the conditions that defined their existence were more closely linked to what Malcolm spoke about than what King represented. Consequently, he was able to establish a strong audience among urban blacks who perceived passive resistance as an insufficient tool for dismantling institutional racism. Malcolm's later day metamorphosis from an angry black militant into a multicultural American icon was the product of the extraordinary success of the autobiography of Malcolm X, co authored by the writer Alex Haley and released 9 months after the assassination. A bestseller in its initial years of publication, the book soon established itself as a standard text in hundreds of college and university curricula. By the late 1960s, an entire generation of African American poets and writers were producing a seemingly endless body of work, paying homage to their fallen idol. In their imagination, Malcolm's image became permanently frozen, always displaying a broad, somewhat mischievous smile, spotlessly well attired, and devoting to the advancing the interests and aspirations of his people. From the moment of his murder, widely different groups, including Trotskyists, black cultural nationalists, and Sunni Muslims, claimed him. Hundreds of institutions and neighborhood clubs were renamed to honor the man whom Ossie Davis had eulogized as our manhood, our living black manhood. A Malcolm X Association was initiated by African Americans in the military. In Harlem, activists formed a Malcolm X Democrat Club. In 1968, the independent film producer Marvin Worth hired James Baldwin to write a screenplay based on the autobiography, a project the novelist described as My Confession is the story of any black cat in this curious place and time. By the early 70s, Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's wife, was invited as an honored guest to a Washington, D.C. fundraiser gala promoting the reelection of Richard Nixon. The renaissance of Malcolm's popularity in the early 90s was largely due to the rise of the hip hop nation. In the group Public Enemy's video Shut 'Em Down, for example, the image of Malcolm is imposed over the face of George Washington on the US dollar bill. Another hip hop group, Gang Starr, placed a portrait of Malcolm on the cover of one of its CDs. Political conservatives also continued their attempts to assimilate Malcolm into their pantheon. In the aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles race riots, for instance, Vice President Dan Quayle declared that he had acquired important insights into the reasons for such unrest by reading Malcolm X's biography, an epiphany most African Americans viewed as absurd, with filmmaker Spike Lee quipping, "Every time Malcolm X talked about blue-eyed devils, Quayle should think he's talking about him." With the release of Lee's 3-hour biographical film X that same year, Malcolm reached a new generation. In a 1992 poll, 84% of African Americans between the ages of 15 and 24 described him as a hero for Black Americans today. After years of relegating him to the periphery of modern Black history, historians now began to see him as a central figure. He had become an integral part of the scaffolding that supports a contemporary African American identity, historian Gerald Horne wrote. His fascination with music and dance in nightclubs undergirded his bond with blacks. For many whites, however, his appeal was located in his conversion from militant black separatism to what might be described as multicultural universalism. His assimilation into the American mainstream occurred, ironically, at Harlem's Apollo Theater on January 20th, 1999, when the United States Postal Service celebrated the release of Malcolm X stamp there. In a press statement accompanying the issuance, the Postal Service claimed that in the year prior to his assassination, Malcolm X had become an advocate of a more integrationist solution to racial problems. So, taking us all the way from what happens at the Audubon to how does Malcolm X become, as he says here at the title of his book, this is about a life of reinvention. How does Malcolm X get reinvented in the American imagination? That's what this book is about. All right. I'm going to read you this final section from Martin Luther King's message. Well, it's not the final section, it is part of part two. His message is a tough mind and a tender heart. Let's take a look. Section two, coming from the work Strength to Love. And then we're going to go into our talk back over here on Life Nation. But we must not stop with the cultivation of a tough mind. The gospel also demands a tender heart. Tough mindedness without tender heartedness is cold and detached, leaving one's life in a perpetual winter, devoid of the warmth of spring and the gentle heat of summer. What is more tragic than to see a person who has risen to the disciplined heights of tough mindedness, but has at the same time sunk to the passionless depths of hard heartedness? The hard hearted person never truly loves. He engages in a crass utilitarianism that values other people mainly according to their usefulness to him. He never experiences the beauty of friendship because he is too cold to feel affection for another and too self centered to share another's joy and sorrow. He is an isolated island. No outpouring of love links him with the mainland of humanity. The hard hearted person lacks the capacity for genuine compassion. He is unmoved by the pains and afflictions of his brothers. He passes unfortunate men every day, but he never really sees them. He gives dollars to a worthwhile charity, but he gives not of his spirit. The hard hearted individual never sees people, but rather as mere objects or as impersonal cogs in an ever turning wheel. In the vast wheel of industry, he sees men as hands. In the massive wheel of big city life, he sees men as digits in a multitude. In the deadly wheel of army life, he sees men as numbers in a regiment. He depersonalizes life. Jesus frequently illustrated the characteristics of the hard hearted. The rich fool was condemned not because he was not tough minded, but rather because he was not tender hearted. Life for him was a mirror in which he only saw himself and not a window through which he saw other selves. Dives went to hell not because he was wealthy, but because he was not tender-hearted enough to see Lazarus and because he made no attempt to bridge the gulf between himself and his brother. Jesus reminds us that the good life combines the toughness of the serpent and the tenderness of the dove. To have serpent like qualities devoid of dove like qualities is to be passionless, mean, and selfish. To have dove like without serpent like qualities is to be sentimental, anemic, and aimless. We must combine strongly marked antitheses. We as Negroes must bring together tough mindedness and tender heartedness if we are to move creatively toward the goal of freedom and justice. Soft minded individuals among us feel that the only way to deal with oppression is by adjusting to it. They acquiesce and resign themselves to segregation. They prefer to remain oppressed. When Moses led the children of Israel from the slavery of Egypt to the freedom of the promised land, he discovered that slaves do not always welcome their deliverers. Oh my God. They would rather bear those ills they have, as Shakespeare pointed out, than flee to others that they know not of. They prefer the flesh pots of Egypt to the ordeals of emancipation. But this is not the way out. Soft minded acquiescence is cowardly. My friends, we cannot win the respect of the white people of the South or elsewhere if we are willing to trade the future of our children for our personal safety and comfort. Moreover, we must learn that passively to accept an unjust system is to cooperate with that system and thereby to become a participant in its evil. And there are hard hearted and bitter individuals among us who will combat the opponent with physical violence and corroding hatred. Violence brings only temporary victories. Violence, by creating many more social problems than it solves, never brings permanent peace. I am convinced that if we succumb to the temptation to use violence in our struggle for freedom, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to them will be never ending reign of chaos. A voice echoing through the corridors of time says to every intemperate Peter, put up thy sword. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations that failed to follow Christ's commands. My God, on today. Martin Luther King said, if we start this in violence, we're going to leave a legacy that future generations will look back on, and it will be a never ending reign of chaos if we start this fight in violence. They won't ever get to the place of peace because violence will be a temporary victory. Listen to the wisdom there. Slaves do not always welcome their deliverers. That's for every activist out here fighting for freedoms. Words to live by. All right, we're going to go into our talk back. If you are on our official Black Table Talk page, I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. If you want to join us on the talk back, please join us at Life Nation KC right here on YouTube as well. We're going to launch into our conversation about the subject matter. And we'll be in conversation for about another 15 minutes. So please feel free to join us there. I want to thank you for your time and attention over on Official Black Table Talk. Remember, next season we will be moving our broadcast there consistently. But right now we are toggling between the two pages because we have 1,400 subscribers over here on Life Nation KC, and we've got about 54 on Black Table Talk. So we are asking our Life Nation subscribers to make sure that you go to Official Black Table Talk right here on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. All right. Thank you so much, Official Black Table Talk, and we will see you all next Monday. Good morning.